The summer of 1944 was the summer that Karl-Heinz Brandt stopped trusting his own experience. He had survived Casino. He had survived 2 winters in Russia, the kind of winters that turned vehicles into sculpture and turned men into something quieter than living. By July in Normandy, Brandt was 26 years old and felt 50. He was a Fallschirmjäger, 3rd Division, and he had spent enough time under shell fire to read it the way a sailor reads weather. You learned the rhythms. You learned what incoming fire was telling you. You learned, above all, what it meant. What was happening on Hill 192 made no sense at all. The Americans were bombarding a hill. That in itself was not unusual. Hills mattered in Normandy the way they always matter in war. Whoever stands on high ground sees everything below. What was unusual was the scale. One American infantry division, the 2nd, was putting what witnesses counted as 20 separate fire missions on a single hill in a single night. The 29th Division, in one 24-hour period, fired 459 missions, 13,000 shells. Aerial reconnaissance photographs came back showing terrain that looked, as one German staff officer wrote in his diary, like a blanket eaten by moths. Craters overlapping craters. The earth churned and rechurned until the original shape of the hill was almost unrecognizable. Brandt and every other German officer looking at those numbers reached the same conclusion. The Americans did not know what they were doing. This conclusion was not arrogance. It was arithmetic. It was the only arithmetic anyone in the Wehrmacht had been permitted to use since 1939. To understand why Brandt drew that conclusion, you have to understand what a German artillery officer believed in his bones. The number was 50. 50 shells per gun per day. That was the standard allocation on the Eastern Front by the end of 1941. Not 50 shells per engagement. 50 shells per gun per entire day across an entire front that stretched further than anyone had imagined possible when they crossed into the Soviet Union. That number shaped everything. Every manual, every drill, every reflex. The German military doctrine, Truppenführung, was not a document born of abundance. It was a document born of a nation that knew from the beginning that it would never have enough of anything. Not enough shells, not enough horses, not enough time. By 1944, the German artillery in Normandy was, in many ways, a museum. General Eberbach's forces were pulling guns from every corner of occupied Europe. French pieces captured in 1940, Czech guns acquired in 1938, Russian trophies dragged west, weapons from the First World War that had been refurbished and pressed back into service. Each gun fired different caliber ammunition. Each required different spare parts. The logistics were a nightmare, and the logisticians knew it, and they planned accordingly. Every shell was rationed. Every shell was justified. The doctrine that emerged from scarcity was, in its own way, beautiful. A German battery in Normandy could place its first rounds within 50 meters of a target at 10 kilometers distance. The gunnery was precise because it had to be. You did not fire until you had calculated. You did not calculate until you had observed. You did not waste because wasting was not a category that existed in the German military vocabulary. It was simply failure. There was a strict hierarchy of targets. Counter-battery fire came first. Silence the enemy guns before they silence yours. Then immediate threats to the infantry, the tank assault bearing down on your positions. Then, if shells remained, harassing fire against enemy command posts. Everything had a priority. Everything had a justification. A German artillery officer who could not explain why he had fired a particular shell had done something wrong. The speed this cost them was understood and accepted. Shifting fire to a new target required 10 to 15 minutes of calculation. Surveyors had to plot positions. Data had to be confirmed. The system demanded precision, and precision demanded time, and time was considered a fair price for not squandering what you could not replace. What this meant, in practice, was that a German artillery officer looking at an American barrage had only one framework available to him. He counted the shells. He divided by the probable results, the casualties inflicted, the positions destroyed, the vehicles disabled. He compared that ratio against the standard his entire career had been built on. And when the ratio came back at something approaching madness, he wrote in his report that the Americans were incompetent. No other explanation fit. You did not shell empty hills. You did not fire at empty crossroads at 3 in the morning when you had no observer confirming a target. You did not burn through the equivalent of an entire battery's weekly allocation against a patch of Norman hedgerow that contained, as far as anyone could determine, nothing at all. It was not how professionals behaved. Here is what Brandt could not have known on that July night, listening to American guns work the darkness around him. The Americans were not missing. They were not confused. They were not wasteful. They were not demonstrating incompetence. Every one of those 13,000 shells on Hill 192 was doing exactly what it was intended to do. And what it was intended to do had nothing to do with killing anyone in particular. The Americans had arrived at a conclusion so foreign to the German way of war that there was not even a word for it in the Truppenführung. They had decided, at the level of official doctrine, that a shell which killed nobody could still be doing useful work. They had stopped aiming at people. They had started aiming at possibilities. Karl-Heinz Brandt read the barrage as madness. He was looking at the future of industrial warfare, and he was reading it backwards, through the lens of a nation that had never had enough of anything. The hill was not the target. The night was the target. The idea sounds almost too simple when you say it out loud. You don't need to kill someone with every bullet. You just need them to believe you might. That was the heart of what the United States Army called H&I fire, harassing and interdiction. The name itself is almost bureaucratic, colorless, the kind of phrase that sounds like it belongs in a procurement manual rather than a doctrine that would reshape the Western Front. But behind the bland terminology was a concept so radical that only one kind of nation could have believed in it enough to actually execute it. A nation that had decided, at the highest levels of military planning, that ammunition was not a resource to be rationed. It was a resource to be spent. Picture a crossroads, 12 kilometers behind the German front line. No American observer can see it. No spotter plane is circling overhead in the dark. There is no confirmed intelligence that anything of military value is moving through that intersection at this particular hour. By every principle Karl-Heinz Brandt had been trained to respect, that crossroads does not deserve a single shell. The Americans dropped rounds on it at 2:23 in the morning, then at 3:07, then at 4:18. Random intervals, random but deliberate, a metronome with an irregular beat. Now think about what happens to the German supply column scheduled to move through that crossroads before dawn. Maybe it turns back. Maybe it pushes through and loses a truck, one vehicle, one crew, one load of rations or ammunition or medical supplies that never arrives. Maybe it reaches the front on time, but 2 hours late, which means the men who needed those supplies waited in their positions, hungry, while the artillery situation that required those shells developed without the resources to answer it. Maybe the column arrives safely, but the drivers haven't slept in 36 hours because every crossroads between the depot and the front has been getting hit at unpredictable intervals for the last 4 nights, and men who haven't slept make decisions that kill themselves and the people around them. Nobody in that entire sequence of events needed to die for the American shells to do their work. The German officer in the trench who had been waiting for food for 2 days was not wounded by American artillery. He was weakened by it. His hands shook a little more. His decisions were a little slower. His tolerance for what he was being asked to endure was a little lower. Multiply that man by 10,000. Multiply that crossroads by 200. Multiply those nights by weeks, and then months. American gunners called this effect a force multiplier. The phrase is military shorthand, but what it meant in practice was something almost philosophical. You could degrade an enemy's combat power without ever putting a round on target. You could fight the German army's capability rather than its body count. You could win by subtraction, not of lives, but of options. The Wehrmacht had no answer to this, not because German soldiers lacked courage or German officers lacked intelligence, because Germany did not have the shells. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who spent more time in the dirt with American soldiers than almost any other journalist of the war, wrote in 1943 that he had heard officers joke that they had more guns than they knew what to do with. He wrote it as color, a small detail to illustrate the contrast with what he had seen in North Africa. He did not fully understand, and perhaps the officers didn't either, that they were describing the entire strategic situation in a single offhand sentence. An American battery could put a round on a new target in 3 minutes. A German battery needed 10 to 15. That gap, 7 to 12 minutes, was not just a technical difference. It was a different relationship with time, and with risk, and with what you thought war was for. None of this floated in the air by itself. Doctrines do not execute themselves. The reason the Americans could afford to treat shells as a river rather than a reservoir had a name, and the name was Red Ball Express. On the 25th of August, 1944, the United States Army opened a dedicated one-way trucking route from the Normandy beaches toward the advancing front. The route was marked with red balls on signs at every junction. Civilian traffic was banned. Military traffic that wasn't part of the express moved aside. Around 6,000 trucks ran that road in continuous rotation, day and night, in shifts that didn't pause for darkness or weather. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved 12,500 tons of supplies in a single day. Over 83 days of operation, it delivered 412,000 tons to 28 divisions fighting their way across France. 3/4 of the drivers were African-American soldiers serving in a segregated army that would not allow them to fight in integrated combat units. The United States decorated its combat heroes extensively and carefully, and the men of the Red Ball Express received considerably less attention. What they received instead was the knowledge that without them, the front stopped. The shells stopped. The food stopped. The fuel stopped. The entire operational momentum of the Western Allied advance ran on the road they kept moving. The contrast with the Wehrmacht situation needs no dramatization. German artillery in Normandy moved on horses. In the Ardennes, in December of '44, there were sectors where the German army had more horses than motorized vehicles, not as a metaphor, as a logistical reality. The army that built the V-2 rocket and put a jet-powered fighter in the sky was pulling its field guns with animals because steel and fuel and rubber had run out in the places where they were needed most, and the road network behind the German lines was being taken apart by Allied air power faster than it could be repaired. American planners thought in tons. General Bradley's staff calculated that each of his 28 divisions required between 700 and 750 tons of supplies per day to maintain offensive operations. The total was something approaching 20,000 tons every 24 hours, just to keep the army moving. Bradley's logistics officers did not count soldiers. They counted tonnage. A soldier was, in their planning, a function of the supplies that reached him. In May of 1942, American industry produced 567,000 artillery shells of 155mm caliber in a single month. For comparison, and the comparison matters enormously, American production of the same shell in May of 2023 was around 28,000 per month. The wartime economy had been reconfigured at a depth that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the outside. Factories that had been making refrigerators were making shell casings. Workers who had been assembling automobiles were assembling fuses. The entire productive capacity of the largest industrial economy on Earth had been pointed in one direction. There is a photograph in the National Archives dated the 31st of December, 1944. It shows the crew of Battery C, 28th Field Artillery Battalion. They are holding a shell. Someone has written on the casing, in chalk, "For Adolf, Unhappy New Year." The men are grinning. One of them is laughing at something outside the frame. They are grinning because they know that by the time this shell has traveled to wherever it lands, another one will already be on its way from a depot to the gun. And after that one, another. The men on their last shell don't write jokes on it. They just fire it and worry. The Germans understood what was happening to them, but they understood it slowly, and the understanding arrived in pieces. Rommel had written, before the Normandy landing, that if the Allies got ashore and established a supply line, the battle was already lost. He was not referring to courage or tactics. He was doing arithmetic. He knew what German logistics could sustain, and he knew what American industrial capacity could generate, and he knew those two numbers did not belong in the same war. General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armored formations in the German military. After American carpet bombing and subsequent artillery preparation at St. Lo in late July 1944, he described his division's position as a lunar landscape, not a poetic description, a tactical assessment. The ground had been worked so thoroughly that vehicle movement was nearly impossible, communications were destroyed, and the men who had survived the bombardment were, in his word, stunned, not wounded, but no longer capable of organized resistance. An anonymous German major captured after the Ardennes offensive wrote in his debrief that he had stopped thinking about individual engagements. He was thinking about the ratio. For every shell his batteries fired, the Americans answered with what felt like 10. He did not know if the number was accurate. He knew that it felt true. And in an army running on morale as much as materiel, feelings had operational consequences. The crossing of the Rhine in March of 45. American artillery fired 65,000 shells against the eastern bank before the first assault boat touched water. Not to destroy specific positions, to make the entire bank uninhabitable long enough for men to cross it. The resistance that met those boats was a fraction of what it might have been, and the fraction mattered because every man who crossed alive was a man who could be somewhere else the next day. Germany surrendered not when it ran out of soldiers willing to fight. It surrendered when enough of its leaders recognized the arithmetic. The war had become a calculation, and the calculation had only one answer. Here is the verdict that takes a long time to reach, but matters once you reach it. The German artillery officers who looked at American H&I fire and called it incompetence were not stupid. They were measuring by the only yardstick they had ever been given: shells expended per confirmed target destroyed. By that metric, the Americans were genuinely terrible artillerists, phenomenally, almost impressively inefficient. Any German gunnery instructor would have failed them on the examination. The Americans were using a different examination. Their question was not what did this shell hit, but what did this shell prevent? Movement, sleep, resupply, coordination. The slow accumulation of all the things an army needs to do in order to function, each one slightly degraded, each degradation compounding the next. The German doctrine was about precision. The American doctrine was about denial. And denial, it turned out, was something you could only afford if you had enough shells to make it credible, which meant you could only afford it if you had the factories, the ships, the trucks, the roads, the drivers, the fuel, and the organizational will to treat 412,000 tons of supplies as a minimum rather than a miracle. The men standing at those guns in Normandy and in the Rhineland were not strategists. They were 20-year-olds from Ohio and Georgia and Minnesota who had been trained to do a specific job and were doing it. They were not thinking about throughput or industrial capacity or the philosophical distinction between killing and denial. They were thinking about the men in their unit. They were thinking about getting home. They were firing the shells because the shells were there, and because someone had explained to them that firing the shells was how you ended the war faster, and ending the war faster was how you got your friends back to wherever they came from. The system they were part of, without most of them fully knowing they were part of a system, had figured out something the Wehrmacht could never afford to learn. You did not have to be the most accurate army in the field. You had to be the army that made accuracy irrelevant. The shells kept coming. The river never ran dry. And that, in the end, was the whole answer.